Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Welcome to St. Catherine's College at the University of Cambridge for this half-day symposium marking the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. My name is Niamh Gallagher. I am an Associate Professor in Modern British and Irish History here at the University. I'm also a Fellow of this college, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this event today. To have brought so many high-caliber speakers to the college is really wonderful for us all. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everybody here and attending remotely that we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Today's symposium is part of the Cambridge Future of the Island of Ireland series. The series provides a high-profile, accessible and inclusive space for knowledge exchange and debate regarding the future of the island of Ireland and indeed these islands in an evolving geopolitical landscape. You can follow what we do via the St. Catherine's College website in the section entitled Research, where you can sign up to our mailing list to keep informed about future events. Today's symposium, I think, is a really good example of what we can do. We bring academics and leaders from civic and political fora together to discuss matters and collaborate effectively. I'm going to say a few words about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the programme that will follow. The agreement was signed on the 10th of April 1998 after 2 years of multi-party and intergovernmental talks, sanctioned with the support of international partners. The document itself was a feat of diplomacy, signed by Northern Irish and British representatives. April 2023 marked its 25th anniversary, and I attended the official event in Queen's University, Belfast. If any of you were there, and I know some of the speakers were certainly there, you would agree that the atmosphere was overwhelmingly positive. In many ways, this was appropriate, as much was achieved by the passing of the agreement in 1998 that has stood the test of time. The massive reduction in both paramilitary activity and the dismantling of security apparatus within Northern Ireland. The creation of devolved institutions to facilitate a regional power-sharing executive. The establishment of the principle of cross-community consent to ensure that no one designation could dominate the other. The granting of legitimacy to different constitutional aspirations, meaning it is okay to want to remain within the UK or to desire a united Ireland. The realignment of political relations between the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, as well as within the island of Ireland by the creation of cross-border and east-west bodies. The enshrining of human rights, safeguards, and equality of opportunity into the agreement, based on the European Convention on Human Rights and the establishment of a Human Rights Commission in Northern Ireland. The inauguration of reforms to policing and justice to ensure that political structures and the courts are free from partisan political control. And important aspirations, including the advancement of women in public life, the promotion of social cohesion, the achievement of employment equality, and enshrining of linguistic diversity. These are important achievements and indeed aspirations which deserve to be recalled, and I expect we'll hear more about them today. But it is also fair to say that the atmosphere at Queen's was tilted to one side. As researchers and educators, it is incumbent on us to be critical of the subject matter we analyse and consider the other side of the coin, the aspects of the agreement and the expectations of what it could deliver, which perhaps have not worked so well. And just to highlight a few within the political realm, the ongoing parliamentary dysfunction at Stormont and misuse of cross-community mechanisms for politically partisan purposes. Inequity between the governing mechanisms available to voters who cast their vote for non-aligned parties. And by that, I mean parties that don't take an official unionist or nationalist designation, as opposed to voters who cast their votes for one of those parties that does. The relative lack of attention given to Northern Ireland, especially over the last 15 years, by successive UK governments and indeed international partners, meaning that full implementation of what had been promised or aspired to in 1998 has fallen short. The different perceptions over the wording of the agreement that have become much more apparent during the post-Brexit discussions over the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. The issue of legacies for families of people killed during the Troubles, which remains unresolved. at the same time that a generally unpopular solution has now passed the House of Commons and it's making its way through the House of Lords. The ongoing activity of loyalist paramilitaries and dissident Republicans and associated problems of crime and gang violence in the region. The more complicated flip side of this point is the inability of the current system to make inroads into helping predominantly young men who are structurally vulnerable to these organisations to access alternative routes. These political challenges are matched by economic, social and cultural problems. There is chronic economic underdevelopment, persistent segregation, and low levels of educational attainment, which persist among many working class communities, especially in East Belfast and in the Derry and Strabane District Council area. There are significant regional disparities across Northern Ireland in terms of social deprivation, access to employment, public transportation, and indeed access to public services. And that's between the east and the west of the region, but also along border communities. The commitment to linguistic diversity enshrined in the agreement hasn't been delivered and seemingly remains politically contentious, as indeed do other cultural facets, including parades, which have proliferated in the aftermath of 1998. Whether all of these problems can be blamed on the agreement itself is, of course, a very different question, as some have longer roots. I'm sure we'll hear some views on that today. But it does raise the question of whether a document signed in 1998, in a very different world to that of 2023, might be in need of an MOT. Our three panels today have been asked to consider the past, present and future of the agreement, and the format is as follows. Our first panel will focus on the grassroots in different parts of Northern Ireland, providing us with bottom-up perspectives of how the agreement has translated on the ground. Our second panel, while certainly not detached from the grassroots, comprises party politicians who will shed top-down perspectives on the agreement from different political positions. The last panel comprises academics from across these islands who have been asked to shed their views on the previous discussions and to broaden our understanding of the agreement using their respective areas of expertise. We have asked each speaker to prepare a 7-minute intervention, just to be awkward, not 5, not 10, but hopefully 7, followed by 15 or 20 minutes chaired discussion. Due to the tight schedule, we will not be taking questions from the floor until the end of the day, but can I encourage you to please jot them down throughout the panels so we can move full steam ahead at 5:40 p.m. when the Q&A session begins. Our speakers will be introduced by the chairs of each panel, so I'm going to leave the introductions to them. Our chairs today are Dr. Barry Colfer from the Institute of International and European Affairs and a co-convenor of this series. Professor Richard Burke, who is Chair of Political Thought at King's College, Cambridge, and Professor Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy at Clare College, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying, formerly of Talking Politics fame, which I'm sure many of you in the room and joining online have listened to. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy today's discussion, that you will participate in the debate that follows, and I'd like to welcome our first panel today to the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and as Niamh said, I'm the Director of Research at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin, a think tank, and I'm also a Junior Research Fellow here in Politics at St Edmunds College. I'm delighted to be part of this first panel on our conference on 25 years on, what's next for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Our first panel will give grassroots perspectives, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers in a moment. As for format, just to reiterate what Niamh said, each of the speakers will be invited to talk for 7 minutes, and then I'll try to facilitate a discussion between the panellists about the social, economic, cultural and or other impacts of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So to our speakers, we're going to first hear from Mickey Cooper. Hello, Mickey, joining us from his car. Mickey is the owner of DerryBlueBadgeGuide.com, one of Ireland's largest tour guiding companies. Throughout the last 20 years, Mickey has been involved in the development and delivery of a range of community, tourism and heritage projects, and is currently the project manager of the Derry Peacemakers Museum, which will chronicle the evolution of the conflict in the Bogside from August 1972 to 2007, which I really look forward to visiting. Mickey's been involved in the Republican movement since his teens. He served as a councillor for 10 years and is currently chairperson of the Pole Kinsella Cumann in Derry and director of elections for the Foyleside DEA. After Mickey, we're going to hear from Emma Murphy. Emma is the president of Queen's University Belfast Students' Union, and I believe this is one of the last acts that Emma will undertake in that role. So congratulations for your term, Emma. Emma studied English literature at Queen's, participated in the Washington Ireland class of 2021, and will be known to many of you for having opened the Agreement 25 conference celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement alongside Hillary Clinton and George Mitchell last April. Mark Langhammer will go next. Mark leads the National Education Union, Europe's largest education union in Northern Ireland. Mark served as chair of the Northern Ireland Citizens Advice Bureau and as an independent Labour councillor throughout the 1990s until 2005. Mark also served on the national executive of the Irish Labour Party from 2005 through 2008. Mark is the author of 2 books and has written in a variety of local and UK publications on education, industrial relations, trade unionism and politics. Finally, we'll hear from Brian Dougherty. Brian has been involved in the voluntary and community sector for over 25 years, working primarily in unionist loyalist communities. Brian is currently CEO with the Northwest Cultural Partnership, which is a collective group of 6 cultural organisations who work extensively across the Derry Strabane District Council area, across the province, cross-border and indeed internationally. Brian is also co-chair of the Northern Ireland Department for Communities, Ulster Scots Language, Heritage and Cultural Strategy. In 2007, Brian received an MBE for services to the community in Northern Ireland, and he's currently studying for a PhD at UU Ulster University, where he's examining progressive leadership through the Londonderry Bands Forum, which is a thesis I look forward to reading. So without further ado, Mickey, you'll go first, then Emma, Mark, Brian. Please do listen to each other and be prepared to challenge and comment on what each speaker says. So Mickey, you have the floor if you're still there.
Thanks very much, Barry. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Very well.
No problem, because my connection is not fantastic. I thought it was better, but hopefully I'm coming through clear enough. If the connection is bad, I'll knock my camera off just to maybe improve it, but hopefully you're hearing okay. So obviously you outlined my different roles, and I'll come at this probably first from the political perspective, but that will inform a lot of my work then in the community sector. The tour guiding element of it is in many ways my own private work, but a lot of that overlaps into what we're doing in the community sector as well. So I'll try and connect all of those to what's going on locally and really the mainly bog side sort of area. That's where I will do most of my work, which is a very famous brand name almost at this stage in terms of the conflict, but also the peace process as well, which is why we're doing this this new museum development out over the next year, but we'll come to that later. I mean, from a political perspective, first of all, in the sort of overview element of this, you know, from our perspective, 25 years ago when we signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, and I was involved back then very heavily as well with the Republican movement. It was a compromise. I mean, and probably the point that a lot of people missed at the time, and in terms of maybe unionism, but in particular British government and Irish government, as far as I'm concerned as well, there was probably a view at that stage that getting all the main parties signed up to the agreement, with the exception of the DUP at that stage, would in a way allow the middle ground to develop in terms of maybe LP Ulster Unionist sort of approach of power sharing, cross-border cooperation, and that would take legs to a point that the question of United Ireland would become less of an issue, because people would maybe, if you want to say, be happy with their lot in terms of broader nationalism, the sort of middle grounds, population, if you want to call it Alliance Party voters, people like that, and at that larger middle ground and moderate nationalism, moderate unionism would take the majority of the political ground, and in a sense, United Ireland would become less of an issue. From our perspective, the border pool provision was the core reason why we signed up to the agreement, and in many ways, depending on your viewpoint, from our perspective, was the prize going forward from unionist perspective. You know, from maybe a more hardline unionist perspective, more of the ticking time bomb, but all depending on what your view was of where demographics would go and where voting patterns would go. And obviously now, with the growth of Sinn Féin, the whole debate on Irish unity has now increased. So that idea of what the agreement would do at the time, I think certainly what the British government, Irish governments hoped it would do, in terms of maybe kicking United Ireland further down the road, but letting those who wanted it to deal with it in a political approach as opposed to an armed approach, which obviously was the case in the past, that it would sort of and hopefully die a death in many ways. But I think what's happened has been the opposite in terms of how people have chosen their votes in the north. And obviously with Brexit, that's and accelerated that significantly. The irony of all of that being obviously nationalism in general campaigned against Brexit, more of a unionist body politic campaigned for it, but ultimately, in terms of the middle ground, especially, there's an element of that middle ground votes which maybe would be unionist, but which would be maybe considering a different approach because of the economic impact of Brexit, which has already been felt massively, particularly across the community sector, but also in terms of infrastructure, farming, in terms of loss of subsidies. A lot of that only kicking in now in the very recent past and still to have an impact. So we're only now seeing the impact of Brexit. And again, that all ties into the idea of when the border pool does happen, which won't be tomorrow. Obviously, it has to be built on the sort of approach of republicanism about when you would push for that in a more sustained way, when we know the demographics would be more favourable. But all of that obviously plays into our hands, which is the supreme irony of the whole Brexit debate in terms of the North, because of those who supported it and those who opposed it. So I think that's in terms of laying out the broader sort of grounds of what we're, and again, I would be speaking in a personal capacity here, not for the party, but obviously given a fairly decent insight into what the thinking would be. The agreement in terms of the dealing with reconciliation, dealing with unionism in general. I mean, the approach would have been very much, and Martin McGuinness and people like that would have driven this in particular, the idea that, as opposed to having joint rule in the North, which was, in terms of the agreement, that the two alternative sort of models and as in terms of interim arrangements before Irish unity would happen, the two models that we were, as far as we were concerned, would apply would either be a form of joint rule between the two governments or power sharing. Martin said it was much more preferable that unionists and nationalists ran the place. Himself and Ian Paisley in particular are very vociferous about that they were taken over from British direct rule ministers and making a point of local decisions being made, and that was, from our perspective, core as the sort of middle term position, medium term position, and letting people here make decisions. That has obviously not been the case more recently. We had obviously Martin resigning from government over the whole Irish language and RHI scandal, and then with the situation now with the DUP over the protocol, and potentially other reasons as well. We don't have an existing power sharing structure. If you're looking at the tea leaves, I would have said September, October, that may very well change. From our perspective, the DUP have nowhere else to go on this, and we'll be back into a power sharing arrangement, which is all good because we want to have that power sharing element. But again, it's how that is practiced. Martin very famously said that Republicans, nationalists wanted to share power. Unionists did it because they had to share power. Now, we don't want that to be the case. We want both sides to be in there in an enthusiastic sort of way, if you want to put it like that. And that hasn't been the case up until now, our perspective on how unionists have been engaging with power sharing, but hopefully that will change. And it was referred to about regional disparity there. And on the local element, in terms of Derry and Strabane, we are lagging behind Belfast. We're not the size of Belfast. We're not stupid. We're not if you want to call it a capital city. Obviously, from a Republican perspective, we don't usually use that term about Belfast in terms of partition, but the reality is Belfast has a bigger core infrastructure, has more core investments historically. So we are playing catch up anyway. We're a smaller city, but in terms of the size of the university here, which has been well versed, I spent all my academic time at McGee locally, did all my degrees there. It's a very good university, but it's too small. Simple as that. In terms of road infrastructure, connectivity by rail, all of that is still lagging well behind. So from our local perspective here, that all has an impact economically, which in turn then impacts on economic opportunities for especially those who are not in employment or education or in any sort of way economically active. And that is the core audience we're dealing with, if you like, in the Bogside area, and trying to create opportunities for them so that they don't feel disenfranchised is core. The agreement, from our perspective, as I said, politically created the opportunity for Irish unity by political means. Obviously, dissident groups would argue otherwise and argue Copperfasten's partition. They will have a debate. They're going to have to debate with us when the border pool is announced. How they're going to approach that? Are they going to come out and campaign with us? Because it's supposed to be their core aim, United Ireland, as much as ours. Are they not going to go out and campaign for it because of the fact it's a provision of the agreement which they claim to oppose? all of those discussions are there in terms of that dissonant votes and that dissonant or lack of votes. In many cases, they don't vote at all, but trying to get those people energized, they actually go out and campaign for Irish unity and actually take part in the poll. But the people, the younger people who would maybe align themselves to those groups, a lot of them are aligned to those groups because of hopelessness. There's still major economic issues in the city. Bogside, those areas, still high areas of male unemployment. And none of that's going to change overnight. But we do have a situation now where we feel that the boat is gradually turning in terms of the investment in the university, even announced a few weeks ago by the Irish government, which is very telling in its own right, that they're becoming more and more involved in terms of that investment in what should be a Northwest university, that they cater for not just Derry, but the Donegal hinterland as well. And all of that, from our perspective, makes sense, because once a border is removed, it has to be governed, the island, on a regional basis, not just on the lines of the border, but in terms of the Northwest, the West, the Southwest, and the East Coast. And how that would look in an all-Ireland structure. Would there be one parliament in Dublin? Would there be regional parliaments? Is all up for grabs in terms of that debate with unionism. But in terms of the area I'm dealing with, all of these projects around community tourism, the museums we're developing, the tour guiding projects, all of that, it's creating employment. It's telling our story. But again, it's trying to create economic opportunity so that young people in the area will see that there's actually a reason to be hopeful about the future. That is not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of work to do to get them back in the education and get them into a sort of mindset of positivity. So we're very much a mixed bag locally, and we're in an area where there is one of these so-called peace walls very close to us. Brian will be able to talk about it more from the unionist perspective in terms of the Fountain Bishop Street peace wall. But a lot of work that we've done locally is around softening that wall in terms of its impact and having actually pedestrian access between the areas, so people will go between the Unionist Republican sides, which are now doing on a fairly regular basis. So a bit sort of osmosis almost of the wall still being there, but people seeing it less as a sort of physical and political barrier between the two populations. So we have a job of work to do locally here of trying to get that younger, if you like, not pro-dissonant element, but those who could be aligned to dissidents or attracted to them. And I put those in the minority in terms of those young people. A lot of the young people here, because the programs that are delivered, they are a bit more realistic. A lot of people are not interested in politics, and that's a good sign in one sense, because it shows people have moved on in terms of the attitudes we would have had when we were growing up. We were very political for obvious reasons because of what was going on in the streets and the British Army's behaviour, RUC's actions in our areas, which is now thankfully a thing of the past. So managing a lot of young people and getting them involved in politics is actually an issue, because they're more interested in social media. They're not engaged in many ways in politics. And then those who are attracted to those dissident groups, getting them engaged more economically as well as politically, trying to get them animated around the idea of Irish unity can be achieved politically, as opposed to what they're being told by others. And at the same time, dealing with the unionist minority in the city. Demographics here are very different from Belfast. We have an issue of unionism feeling disenfranchised in many ways, the same as the nationalist majority here before the conflict began, and there's a confidence building element there. So all of this plays under the wider idea of how the agreement will be rolled out in the next 10 years, because it is very imperfect. The idea of cross-border cooperation or cross-party cooperation and cross-community cooperation has been stop-starts for all the reasons I've outlined earlier. And unionism, I know, is very defensive because of the future. And the border poll now looming more and more largely is creating issues.
Mickey, it feels like a good point to interrupt you if you can hear me.
Go ahead, yep.
Yeah, no, it's been absolutely brilliant. And if you just kind of hold on to anything else you have to say there, I want to hand over to the other panelists to make sure there's time to discuss. So do you want to just sum up very quickly, and then I'll hand over to Emma?
Yep, absolutely. I was just coming to that because, as I said, going back to where I started and coming back to finish off, the wider political environment we have here at the minute is very much limbo, is probably one word I would use to describe it. And that's why, in terms of our local perspective here, the projects we're engaged in is very much trying to manage those young people from our own areas and what their expectations are for the future economically and politically, and at the same time deal with a unionist minority that is nervous about the future, trying to engage them. A lot of that work hasn't really started yet. It's only started. And our job of work now in the next 10 years is push for the border poll politically. That is very much still our view. But at the same time, trying to do it in a way that lets unionism feel that they're going to be accommodated and not have to be not having to defend themselves in a sense in a united Ireland and protect their position, but take that position with everybody else. And that's a job of work that we're still only starting, but hopefully we'll be able to build up that discussion more in the next few years when that debate opens up.
Thanks a million, and indeed over the course of today I think we may have some of that discussion, so thanks a million. Your talk of young people is actually, it's a perfect introduction to Emma with your experience as a student leader, representing people from across society of all persuasions and none. Emma, over to you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that from my background, having participated not only in the Queen's Conference, but conferences like these, I'm always quite aware that I'm usually the youngest person on the panels. I think that as someone that's been born after the Good Friday Agreement, my perspective, my kind of lived experience has always been after it's already happened. I think that for many it was a massive societal, cultural change, and for a lot of people they reflect that there's a before and afterwards, whereas I've kind of always lived in the after. And I think that for young people today, they kind of shape their experience, their life in Northern Ireland around some of the kind of key components that have come out of the Good Friday Agreement. For a lot of young people, the thought of violence, really stringent kind of infrastructure in the city centre, all of those different things is usually passed down from generation to generation. I know that from growing up in my household, it was always kind of from my parents' perspective. They were telling me about their lives and their kind of experiences that were so much more different than mine. I think the kind of question around is the agreement still relevant to young people today is a really interesting one, because I think that it's almost, it is a kind of given in a lot of senses, as well as being incredibly relevant. I think that what has kind of struck me in a year of anniversary and lots of different kind of events bringing that kind of, sorry.
Don't be sorry, I'm just going to move it a little bit closer to you.
Amazing. Oh, that's even better. Cool. But yeah, I think that in terms of all of the events that have been happening throughout the past year, for me, what it has really brought into focus is just the lack of education around what the agreement was, how it came about, that young people don't necessarily know everything about it. I think even myself, I was learning for the first time about the Women's Coalition kind of role in the peace negotiations. It's kind of only come about through the different cultural events that have happened, the different political events, that young people have started to learn more about it. And I think that there, as Mickey was saying, there is that apathy there with politics as well these days. I think that from the perspective of young people that are living in a cost of living crisis and they see that the government isn't sitting, I think that in terms of that reality and that day-to-day experience, it seems to be a lot more of a tangible urgency for them compared to reflecting on something that from their perspective happened before they were born. I think that in terms of reform, there's definitely a big question around what keeps young people involved in politics as well, that if there is a constant stop-start installment, how is the next generation meant to come along and question the agreement itself? How is there meant to be that reform coming through government if it's not sitting? I think that young people have really pertinent and honest questions around all of these different things, because there's some that just don't care. They just constantly see a lack of funding being given to higher education, further education, colleges. They see a future that is increasingly more appealing to be not only in the rest of the UK, but further afield as well. I think there's a lot more global opportunities there. And I think that in terms of the different events that have been happening as well, I think that because there hasn't been that reach out to youth communities, that can sometimes feel that they don't have their voice to challenge what the status quo is. So to kind of sum up the initial thoughts that I have is that I think that the events that have happened have been great to commemorate a lot of the different celebrations that have come, and the good things, the benefits that it has brought to society in Northern Ireland. Again, I think for a lot of people, there definitely wouldn't be a way forward without it having happened. But I think that as these conversations are happening, there is such a space that needs to be created then for the what next, because I fear that more and more young people become disenfranchised, move away, and just don't want to get involved. They just don't care anymore. And without that kind of drive to build a meaningful conversation where they feel like they're part of it and they feel that it reflects their politics, I think that it's a lot less divisive. There's a lot more international students that I kind of interact with on a daily basis now. There's a really growing population of people that are in the middle and don't necessarily care about the very, very opposite ends of the political spectrum. And I think that they're much more focused on the issues that are affecting them, such as housing, equality, all of those different things as well. So yeah, I think that's the kind of main driver that I see at the moment.
Cool. Thanks, William Emma. So we'll move down the line to, who did I say we'll go next? To Mark, please.
Thanks, Barry. I supported the peace process at the time, but I sort of felt that the Good Friday Agreement was a poor outcome. It was certainly intricate, but it was sort of, in my opinion, a stick and plaster solution, which I guess was fair enough because it was a compromise, as Mickey said. What it did, though, for me and my family is it allowed my children, who were born in the early 90s before the ceasefires, to lead a pretty normal life compared to my generation. So we shouldn't underestimate the good that has come out of it. My sort of assessment is that the first 10 years after the Good Friday Agreement, even though the institutions were stop-start and didn't actually sort of emerge properly until after the St Andrews Agreement in, I think, late 2006, those first 10 years were probably the best in the sense that there was a fair bit of money flying about, there was a bit more investment, there were peace funds, and there was a bit of creativity. And then we had the financial capitalism crash in 2008, 2009, and then we got a Conservative government in 2010 that introduced austerity measures and continues to do so. And that has had, in my opinion, a fairly crippling effect on the institutions at Stormont. I think the fatal weakness of the Good Friday Agreement is the centrality placed on Stormont as the core institution. The North-South Ministerial Council is sort of can be blocked and messed about by Stormont. For sure, the North-South bodies get on with their own workaday business. The East-West arrangements, frankly, from my point of view, look like pink fluffy stuff that happen when they happen. I do agree with Niamh that the attention of both governments, British and Irish, has been imperfect. There's been very little intergovernmentalism. But in stressing about Stormont, I think Stormont or Northern Ireland as an entity, it really is a very unsuitable region to implement a single unit of devolved government. When you think back, the Protestant Parliament for Protestant people was collapsed in 1972. It failed. The next one was Sunningdale, power sharing, failed in 74. Then you had the Constitutional Conventions, failed in 75. Then you had the Assembly of 82-86, failed then. Then you had the pre-talks forum, which nobody could describe as a success. And in the Good Friday period, I've lost count. Is it 8, 10, 15 times? How many times has it collapsed? So we're talking about an unstable entity, and I think we need to do something to introduce some more fluidity into your institutions so that they're not collapsible, automatically collapsible. I'm not saying Stormont has done nothing. From my point of view as a trade unionist, I can say that Stormont has at times worked as a shelter from austerity to a degree. So, for instance, during the British welfare reforms, the bedroom tax and all that suite of policies, a number of mitigations were introduced, and that in turn put strain on the Stormont budget, but they were introduced. From a union point of view, the Tory Trade Union Act of 2016 wasn't implemented in Northern Ireland because of the veto system, and I think Sinn Féin and others stopped that. So it has worked. I know Conor Murphy's in the room today, and a number of finance ministers, notably Conor, have worked very, very hard to protect public services in difficult circumstances. So I'm not saying Stormont has had an entirely negative effect. It just is fatally unstable. We were asked to comment on, to some degree, on Brexit, and I think Brexit has been a little bit of a watershed in that the DUP took they didn't need to take a hands-on strong role in this, but they chose to do so, and they aligned themselves with the ERG. They aligned themselves. In fact, they took the dark money from Aaron Banks. They played a significant role in trying to get the hardest of hard Brexits. Now, I'm not entirely sure what was in their minds at that stage, but one can really only surmise that the DUP wanted the hardest of hard borders. They must have wanted some sort of a Trumpian Mexican wall there. I don't know the degree to which Dominic Cummings, his answer was a third option, not the Irish Sea border and not the Island of Ireland border. His idea was to put pressure on Ireland to remove itself from the EU. I don't know whether that influenced them or not, but one way or the other, they painted themselves into a bit of a corner. And I think the main outcome of both the collapse of Stormont and the Brexit settlement has been that in Protestant working class areas there has been a degradation. You sort of notice it, because I was a constituency politician in a mixed area, but some of the constituency would have been described as strongly loyalist. I notice when the Protestant community are getting anxious and nervous whenever the flags go up, whenever the curbs are painted, whenever the bonfires grow higher, and that is the case at the minute. There is an anxiety about that, but I don't know what you do about that, because there's no sensible sort of policy response coming out of them. What would you do in the future? I do support devolution, but as I said, not to a single entity. I think, given that we are on the road sometime to a border poll, quite when I don't know. I would much prefer it to come with an actual proposal. But if we're on that road, I think it would be good to bring local government into alignment with the south of Ireland. The south of Ireland have special arrangements for Dublin, and then broadly speaking county councils after that. In the north we could do the same, have a Belfast council and 6 county councils. We're all wedded to our councils. They're not contentious. We're all proud of our councils or of our counties. So that would be one way, and to devolve a lot more power to local government. At the time in which I was in local government, it was priorities as the 3 Bs. We were responsible for bins, bogs and burials, but it is a bit more now. There's planning powers in there, there's some economic development powers, and I think we could load more powers. And what that would mean would be 7 councils, some of which would be unionists, some of which would be nationalists, some of which would be hung, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. So that's one thing. I think we could look at ideas that were floated around the time of the Good Friday Agreement. To me, governmental politics is important, and we're not going to get that in a British direction. Unionists closed down the British Road in the 1980s after the Anglo-Irish Agreement. But we could have Northern participation in Irish presidential elections. I personally would have loved to have voted for Michael D. Higgins as president, and I think he's been a good one. We could have Northern MPs having speaking rights in the Dáil in Dublin. That was floated, and I don't see any good reason for it not to happen. There has been a bit of workaday progress in the shared island stuff coming out of the Taoiseach's office. I've been involved in the one that was a comparison the ESRI did about the education systems north and south. So we should do more of that. But I think we also probably need, and reflecting on what Mickey said, we probably need a bit more intergovernmentalism. Stormont never works unless there's pressure on it, whether that's pressure from Britain and Ireland, from Europe or from the United States. We do need a bit more intergovernmentalism. So I think I'll leave it at that, Barry, and we can pick the rest up.
Thanks a million, Mark. Thanks a million, Mark. Last but not least, Brian.
Thanks, Barry. Not sure what's worse, been asked to speak first or been asked to speak last. I mean, there's a lot I can kind of reflect on in terms of the last 25 years, but given the time constraints at this initial stage, I thought I'd concentrate specifically on kind of two elements. At grassroots level, what I think, from my experience, has specifically worked, and in 2023, as we stand now, what I see the challenges are in grassroots loyalist communities. I mean, as someone who grew up in Londonderry, born 1968, at a time when being a unionist in the city was pretty horrific, to go from that to 1998 to periods of relative calm and peace is always for the better. So I think no matter what I say now or what any of my colleagues have said, I think we've got to kind of keep that in context. We're far better off. We have a far better quality of life in Northern Ireland now at any time than I had grown up. But I think, but in terms of kind of, I suppose, what I've seen in terms of Good Friday Agreement, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement had eight core strands: power sharing, principle of consent, civil and political rights, cultural parity of esteem, police reform, paramilitary disarmament, demilitarisation, and the north, south, east, west institutions. The one that I found most beneficial is one that probably isn't promoted as much as cultural parity of esteem. Londonderry is a pretty unique place, I think, as Michael kind of alluded to. We're peripheral to Belfast, we're peripheral to Dublin, we're peripheral to Westminster, we're peripheral to Brussels. So we really are, as I think Ian Paisley once said, in the periphery of the periphery. But if you live within Derry as well, and particularly in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, unionism is even more peripheral. Between 12 and 15,000 Protestants were forced out of the city centre after 1973 out into the suburbs of the city now. So within unionism and being a unionist in Derry, we're even more peripheral. And the reason I'm saying that is not to complain, but to give a bit of context as to kind of where my work kind of evolved from. We're quite unique, I suppose, or my organisation's quite unique in the sense that it's turned what is normally termed as a negative very much into a positive in terms of improving the quality of life of civic society. I work specifically with pro-union culture, specifically marching bands and the Londonderry Bands Forum. For years growing up, and I'm sure you're very much aware, the marching bands are very much demonised. It was seen as something as almost as foot soldiers towards civic instability. We flipped that on its side quite quickly in the sense that a group of disillusioned, marginalised Protestants who were kind of children of that population movement and who were disillusioned also with political unionism, I have to add, decided that civic society or civic engagement was the way forward. And I think the Good Friday Agreement allowed that platform for us to evolve. It allowed that stability, that kind of eradication almost of violence, allowed organisations like ourselves to really progress communities in the city. So what we've done since is used that band's constituent base, that band network to really improve the quality of life of young, marginalised, disillusioned Protestants, but also as well to maintain a voice or have a voice. Because what I've found through my experience as a grassroots community worker is that not only have we been failed by the governments, but we've been specifically failed by political unionism in the city here. So we have moved, I suppose we've taken that cultural part of esteem principle to the degree now where our organisation has a constituent base, as Barry indicated, that goes right across Northern Ireland, north and south, and internationally as well. Really important in terms not only of maintaining that civic stability, but important in providing that civic voice for unionism. And I don't necessarily agree with some of the comments in terms of Protestants not willing to engage. It's one of my big frustrations and one of the reasons I thank Cambridge for inviting us along here today. Unionists are willing to engage, particularly civic unionists. The Irish government have actually, through a shared island unit, have been very generous in their opportunity for a platform as well. The problem is many unionists don't get the opportunity to engage. We, so in terms of kind of going forward, I think some of our work in the Londonderry Bands Forum has been groundbreaking. We engaged 10 years ago in the Flagpole na Hern during UK State of Culture, which is an Irish traditional festival, as you may know, which would have been unheard of 10, 15 years ago. We developed the Maiden City Accord, which was a parading protocol that was developed to largely resolve the parading issue in the city at that time, which holds firm even today. But I think as Mickey kind of indicated earlier on, a lot of that negotiation in the mid-90s was out of necessity rather than generosity. And I think that kind of leads us on to where I see maybe some of the concerns are now. We, on the 10th anniversary of the UK State of Culture and the bands playing the Flagpole, we asked the same bands, would they be prepared to do it again now if the flag was to come back to Derry? And they all said no. And to me, that was an astounding, disappointing kind of declaration. That 10 years after this groundbreaking work, we've regressed in terms of good relations in the city. And the reason for that leads me on to the challenges as we see, or as we are now. Brexit has been mentioned on a number of occasions. I have to disagree with the fact that I'm certainly no advocate for the DUP, but I have to disagree with the sentiment that the DUP wanted a hard border. It was the only thing I think that most of the political parties were agreed on Brexit, was that there shouldn't be a hard border. But what I do agree is that it kind of changed the landscape a wee bit in terms of good relations in Derry and across Northern Ireland. But the protocol wasn't the only thing. This has been a process that's been unfortunately happening now for a number of years. After there was riots in Derry 2 years ago, we used our constituent base. It was one of the real benefits of working with Londonderry Bands Forums. You get access to grassroots communities. There's 664 bands in Northern Ireland, 30,000 musicians. Why have we never used that constituent base, that network before? We use it quite extensively and find it incredibly useful. And whenever we worked with those young people who were engaged in the riots, we found that there was 6 reasons why there was disillusionment within unionism. And the colleague here is right. Protestants aren't very good at expressing their views. It quite often can take the form of quite basic contentious symbolism. Bonfires do get built bigger. Flagstones do get repainted, murals get touched up. But when you delve a bit deeper to it, you'll find that there's a number of issues that we have to be very careful on. The first out of the 6 that we found were this anti-British narrative that evolved since 2016. I voted to remain. Most of my colleagues who would see themselves as being unionists voted to remain. But very quickly, we were labelled as the right-wing Little Englanders. And it was something that was picked up right across all forms of social and mainstream media. That anti-British narrative, though, didn't just come from the people who we would have expected, like political nationalism, but it came from people who should have known better, including academics, including the Irish government, and including the American government, plus this whole plethora of commentariat, individuals who sprung up in social media. For years, for 3-4 years, that continual drag of kind of whinge and nationalism fed into the Protestant psyche, and all of a sudden the sense of identity and threat of identity and sovereignty became very, very real. There was an issue around political unionism, which to me was the main issue. We did a bit of research last year in partnership with Professor Pete Shirlow at the University of Liverpool, which very clearly identified a huge gap between a third tier of grassroots community development and political unionism. For example, one of the questions we asked was, on surveying 400 unionist households, was how effective they saw political unionism, and only 11% said they saw it as being effective or very effective. So all of a sudden, this disenfranchised, disengaged third tier has become increasingly more vulnerable and more marginalised. There was an issue around policing, and as someone who was part of what was seen as one of the successes of the Good Friday Agreement, I was a member of the inaugural policing board. Unfortunately, that support for local policing seems to have waned somewhat within loyalism. Around that time, you may remember there was controversy around the Bobby Story funeral and how that was policed, but that was part of symptomatic of a broader picture that unionism, or working class unionism, sees policing being more heavy-handed within loyalist areas. Of course, lockdown had an impact as well, where a lot of the community infrastructure that had been built up and social capital that had been built up had kind of been lost. For example, we spoke to a young bandsman and he said, look, had our band practice still been going, we would have been out in the street rioting. Of course, the protocol had an issue to do with it, or at least kind of the people who wanted to use the protocol as an excuse to manipulate young people on the ground. But even now, if you were to walk into any loyalist estate in Northern Ireland and ask someone the top 10 list of concerns, the protocol would be number 10. The next one, I suppose the final one, is local politics. Mickey talked about, Derry being generous in terms of how it deals with unionism. Generally, I would have said that. As someone who's worked for 25 years in the city, I've found a great deal of generosity working with people right across the lines in the city, but I think we're in a pretty bad position with local politics at the minute. I wouldn't trust them to do anything. In Derry, for example, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a pretty aggressive anti-unionist stance. The centenary 2 years ago was basically aggressively ignored and denigrated. The Queen's death in the city, the Queen's death showed that the city was far away from proper good relations. For example, there was cavalcades celebrating her death that went through loyalist areas deliberately. The proclamation on the Sunday was ignored by Derry City Council. The coronation recently, again, aggressively denigrated by council. And then most recently, the hunt system around selection of the mayors in the city, Sinn Féin changed from their generosity of allowing at least one unionist mayor every 4 years. They've reneged on that policy, quite rightly through the hunt, which they were entitled to, but have decided the next 4 years will be a Sinn Féin mayor. So there's an amalgamation, I think, and individually they may not seem important, but if you're walking through a loyalist area now and you look at those 6 ingredients: anti-British narrative, policing, the protocol, political unionism, lockdown, and local politics, that's a pretty toxic mix. And we have to be very careful as civic leaders to ensure that working class, disillusioned third tier doesn't retreat back into any form of significant violence.
Thanks a million, Brian. And I think Mickey is still with us for another quarter of an hour or so. Yeah, great. So I have gathered questions that I would be delighted to put to you, but I very much hope that the four of you, from the grassroots perspective that you've each shared, we can facilitate a discussion between you for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to go back to Mickey. Mickey, do you have any remarks based on what's been said here in Cambridge from the other speakers?
Well, I'll go back to Brian's comments first of all. I work with Brian. I was a member of the City of Culture boards, and also did a number of bits of work with the Bands Forum in terms of even building up some of their own profile, in terms of an online profile, things like that, which is what funding we had through the sort of organisations I work with mainly in the Bogside area. And again, I alluded to the Peace Wall earlier between the two, the Bishop Street Fountain areas, which obviously people here not from local perspective wouldn't be aware of, but similar to it was in Belfast, that have emerged as a result of the conflict period, and we have now that physical ability for people to move between both areas, but also delivering of health and education programs in that area, delivered by organisations that are based in the bog site, but which have very, very deliberately gone out into those areas in terms of that very small unionist area, the Fountain. They try and get people engaged in health and education programs. They basically also literally tell them we don't want them to move out, because that was very much a perspective of a lot of unionists in the city, on the west bank of the city, who maybe still had that siege mentality, that they had some sort of logic in their head that republicanism wanted to create an entirely Republican west bank of the city. The geography of Derry, the River Foyle, one side of the river is almost exclusively nationalist Republican, the other side would be probably 50-50 is probably the best way I would describe it, or at least a very equal representation of unionism and nationalism, with ethnic minorities making up probably another 5 to 10%. But we've done a lot of work in terms of that community approach, as opposed to Sinn Féin as a party, speaking more from the community approach. A lot of work to try and advance that. A work I've done with the apprentice boys in terms of even training them as tour guides through money we had that was provided through the community structures we're involved in our areas, writing letters of support for the Siege Museum, for the apprentice boys, working with First Derry Presbyterian Church to develop their websites, all sorts of various engagements across different strands of PUL, Protestant Unionist Loyalists, which have all been disparate in many ways, as opposed to one single project. But that was all aimed at letting unionism know that we wanted them to be accommodated and be welcomed. I mean, Brian referred to the population movement earlier. From our perspective, and I actually have written contents for panels that are on display in the Fountain area, the unionist area I've referred to. The same text is on same panels on the Republican side of the wall, which refers to the fact that the population movement was complex. It was down to both intimidation, fear of intimidation on both sides. And also, if you were police or army, you were a target for the IIEA. That wasn't a secret. A lot of unionists who were involved in state forces would have obviously felt safer in areas where more unionists would have been residing. And also demographics as well, because of post-73, people all having to vote for the first time in local government elections. Obviously, unionism wanting to consolidate its vote as opposed to being scattered around the city, which wasn't a problem when gerrymandering applied. But that was obviously no longer the case. So there's a whole range of reasons why unionism moved and why Republicans moved from areas of the city as well. But certainly, intimidation and fear of intimidation was one of those elements. And what we're trying to do is make sure that people on the Republican side, because sectarianism, as far as we're concerned, is a disease. It was never something Republicans would have assigned to. People would have been involved in some of those activities and called themselves Republican, which I would argue about using that term to describe those people. But those events happened. But all the stuff we're trying to do is to try and create an atmosphere where unionism feels accommodated. The reference was made about the mayoralty and things like that. The hunt, it means that you can obviously take up the mayoralty based on your number of first preference votes and take up positions of responsibility. And Sinn Féin decided that would be the approach for the next 3 years, to reflect the fact that from our perspective, we wanted to have as much impact as possible as a party in terms of trying to influence the way the government would operate here locally. Unionism obviously would have seen that in a negative sense. I can understand that, but it certainly wasn't the reason why that the mayoralty was chosen for 3 of the 4 years. And I refer to what Brian talked about earlier about when I said that unionism didn't want to share power. I refer very specifically to the DUP approach, and I think civic unionism has gone against the grain in a lot of that element and try to be more positive. And that's what we're trying to encourage further, and not just in Derry, but across the north. And all of this is around the wider debate about Irish unity, because once the border is gone, and that's what we want, we're not hiding that, we never have. The idea is that you won't have a unionism or a republicanism, or those two constituencies in a sense won't exist anymore in a post-reunified Ireland situation. It will be left-right politics, but unionism still having that fear factor of how they'll be accommodated. All the stuff we're trying to do now is very clearly to try and tell them, look, in an all-Ireland system, your identity will be respected. The bands forum and the work they've done, has been very, very significant. And the work that the apprentice boys and others have done as well. All of that means that we have a much more settled situation locally here compared to 10 or 15 years ago. before the marching issue was resolved. And, I was one of the people sat in the walls, blocked the apprentice boys from marching, 1995, whereas a number of years later, I ended up training as tour guides. And all of that was small steps, but a part of a wider picture of trying to create an atmosphere here of toleration. But from our perspective, based on the idea that Irish unity will still be ultimately our goal, but in a way that will not impose on unionism, but will be create an opportunity. And the final thing I would say is around all of this, from the local right up to the regional and the national perspective, power sharing from our perspective is what we want, and power sharing post-Irish unity in terms of unionism being involved in coalition government, whether in Dublin or on a regional basis, is what we want. The difference is Westminster won't be in control. That's the key from our perspective. But we need a unionism that we need a de Klerk effectively to turn around and say, as de Klerk said in South Africa, I'm releasing Mandela. The ANC will probably be running us in a few years. That won't be the same scenario as such here, but in terms of the idea of getting the ground prepared within his own constituency that things were going to change. We need unionism, or political unionism, very specifically, somebody to turn around and say, look, this is going to happen. They haven't done it yet. That's understandable. There's a defensive attitude there, fear of the future. But we need somebody to turn around and say, let's start the debate. And nobody has done that yet. And it needs to happen soon, because from our perspective, devolution under a Westminster context is a temporary arrangement. It will be changing within the next 20 years in terms of the demographics.
I'm just going to interrupt you, Mickey, if you can hear me, can you?
As soon as possible, so we can prepare the ground.
Thanks a million. We may all think who the de Klerk could be. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I want to give a chance for each of the speakers to remark, but given that some of them were directed squarely enough at you, Brian, I'll give you a chance to respond to Mickey's response to yourself, and then Emma, and then Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound too negative. Mickey's exactly right. Some of the work that's gone on in the city has been groundbreaking, and as Mickey indicated, we've worked with him for a long time. But I think that there's one of the quotes that came out of our research last year, I think what you were interviewed for as well, Mickey, was a unionist commented. He says that the unionist community the Derry community, business community, civic society, academic community are deaf to the needs, are silent to the needs of the unionist community, and the unionist community themselves are quite happy to remain silent. And I think that's part of the problem. I think what we have done a wee bit is take our eye off the ball in that respect. And I know, I mean, if kind of how a Sinn Féin run council in Derry, Strabane District Council, is reflective of how Sinn Féin run country would look in United Ireland, then it's not a great advert, and I apologise if you might find that offensive. In terms of the constitutional issue, Mickey, myself and my colleagues at Londonderry Bands Forum have been talking about the constitutional issue for 10, 15 years, and old sessions with the late Donegal McNeilis, Jerry O'Hara and others. It's been a conversation that certain elements understand. It's largely under the radar, and political unionism hasn't picked up the mantle, but that debate around the constitutional issue is happening day and daily, and has been for years. We work very closely with the Department of Foreign Affairs, who are very generous towards our organisation, and the Shared Island Unit as well, who are making significant financial investment into the work. And as I indicated earlier on, we've been invited to the Senate, we've spoken to DFA conferences, we're speaking all the time around a range of issues relevant to unionist community. In terms of constitutional issue, I'm quite happy, to engage in that debate any day of the week. I know Professor John Tong is on later on, but if you reflect on some of the work that's going on at the University of Liverpool under Professor Pete Shirlow, post-Brexit, pre-Brexit and post-Brexit, the figures have been remarkably consistent. Only between 30 and 33% of people polled feel the time is right for a border poll. So I'm not so sure if it's as high in people's agenda as some people would make it out to be. I totally agree. The 50+1 element of the poll isn't what is needed. There's a huge generational debate and change in attitude and change in generosity required for it to be realistic any time in the future.
Thanks a million. And it's a perfect segue, I think, if I lean in, I can be heard. Over to you, Emma. So speaking both from the perspective of a young person, but also someone from Belfast, can you give any comments on what the other three speakers have said that you'd like to share? Just into the mic.
Yeah, I think kind of reflecting on what everyone has said so far, I think that it's clear to me, both from my own perspective as a young person and across the political spectrum, that there is just a great sense of disenfranchisement across the board. I think Mark was speaking earlier about different ways that we could move forward in that way. I think that the conversation about the border poll has kind of almost superseded that, instead of that space being created to kind of have those conversations sometimes about what could be better at Stormont. I think that there is a lot of looking to the future, which is, I don't think that they should be opposing to each other. I think that both can still happen. But I think that focusing on the kind of grassroots element of it, I think that there just does seem to be, from what I'm hearing, is just around that idea of disenfranchisement completely. And I think that there needs to be, alongside all of these constitutional questions and looking towards the future, that kind of re-engagement with people as well. I think that there is just a sense from people that are out in the communities, speaking to people, the frustration that people feel that there is no progress being made at all on not only the kind of constitutional questions but the day-to-day issues. I think that if that changes, then I think that all of the different conversations and eventual political progress becomes a lot more fruitful. So I think that that's something that I'm taking away from this conversation today so far.
Cool. Thanks a million, Emma. Mark, over to you. Do you have any comments on what's been said?
Yeah, well, I think if Mickey's waiting for the clerk, he might be waiting a wee while. I don't know if Sir Geoffrey fits that bill, but I think Sir Geoffrey will probably take the DUP back in sometime in the autumn, because I don't know that there's anything anywhere else to go. Part of the unionist dilemma, I think, back in the 1980s, I was involved in the campaign for Labour representation, and did put forward a fairly straightforward proposal that for as long as we're in the United Kingdom, we should be able to vote for the parties that govern it. In particular, we should be able to join and vote Labour. Now, in doing a lot of campaigning, I was in my 20s at the time. I'm not now, I'm in my 60s now. The entirety of the Unionist family, the entirety of Protestant politics opposed that. What they were opposing was the extension of the British Constitution to Northern Ireland. So having closed the British road, fundamentally, all of them, from PUP and UDA through to Ulster Unionists. The Ulster Unionists, in fact, expelled people who supported British politics. So having closed the British door, there really is only one direction to travel. And that, I think, is at the source of the angst in loyalist areas, to which I'm not unsympathetic, by the way. I was elected from Rathcoole for many, many years. And I do understand particularly the educational disadvantage in those areas, and also the degree of nihilism that there is about. So to leave on a down note, there you go.
Well, there is kind of a down note. We're going to wrap up in a moment, but just we literally have 2 minutes. I think Mickey's gone, is he? Do any of Emma, Brian or Mark want to have any parting words before we move on to our second panel?
Sorry. Just as Mark indicated, we don't want to end a negative. I think, as indicated earlier on, we are in a much more kind of kinder, safer, more generous space than we were 25 years ago. And I agree. I mean, it's great to hear young voices. I have nephews and nieces as well who are a lot more optimistic about the future than perhaps I am. You know, and I think sometimes we've got to remember that we shouldn't get too downbeat. I think that there's a lot of potential good things happen going forward.
Thank you for correcting the down note, Brian. That's a perfect way to end. So, Mickey Cooper, Emma Murphy, Mark Langhammer and Brian Dougherty, thanks a million for your frankness and for your excellent contributions. And if we give a round of applause, please, to the speakers.